What's up, guys? In today's video, we will be speaking to Willem, a friend of mine, a young American in his early 20s who became disillusioned with the US and the state of politics there, leading him to eventually escape to China. We will find out what caused him to become disillusioned and why he thought China, of all places, was where he needed to go to gain perspective. He's somebody who is extremely politically aware, especially when it comes to geopolitics. And although he doesn't really have an online presence at all, I can't help but think he is an influencer or an activist in the making when I have conversations with him. And I wanted you guys to see it for yourself as well. He's quite inspiring to listen to, especially if you've given up on the younger generation and think that particularly the younger generation in the West doesn't have the ability to think outside of the heavy systems of propaganda they have in the West, or who have been funneled into these boxes of left versus right, a dichotomy that seems to be increasingly losing its meaning and distinction. And he is somebody who exists outside of that despite identifying as a socialist. So we'll find out a little bit more about his journey, about what he thinks about current politics, what he thinks about Trump being elected, what he thinks about China, what his journey has been like here, what he has discovered here in China, and what he plans on doing in the future. So without further ado, let's jump right into the conversation. Oh, let me take these flip-flops off.
No brand endorsements.
Yeah. That's really like village style. I got the flip-flops on, and then we're doing a podcast. We've got it could be called the Flip-Flop Podcast. Welcome to the studio.
Hey, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, we have an interesting story about how we met, and I'll set it up because I've told the story before, and we were at this place, Shots, this famous kind of bar here in Chongqing that everybody goes to, or a lot of the foreigners go to, and we were doing a pub quiz, and we didn't do that well on a pub quiz. I was together with one of my buddies from the UK. You know him, so he does book publishing and very much into the socialist movement and stuff like that. Very politically active as well. And we didn't do too well. And so we said, damn, if this was a geopolitical pub quiz, we would have done really well. And then our Irish friend comes over and says, oh, you guys know a little bit about geopolitics, do you? And of course, he doesn't believe us because he really knows. He does know a lot about geopolitics. And then he starts talking to us and he realizes, okay, all right, we know a few things. And so my friend says, oh, this is his channel, Daniel Dumbrill. So he writes it down. He says, okay, I'll look you up. And then you come in, and then you see it's written down on the paper, right? Yeah. And you're like, oh, I know that guy, Daniel Dumbrill. He's, Glenn Greenwald. You're putting me up there with all these people. And our Irish friend looks at you and says, oh, really? Would you like to meet him? And he says, yeah, sure. He's sitting right here. That was what was your reaction when that happened?
Honestly, I couldn't believe it. I gone off out of a long day of work. I was half asleep. I thought, I might as well go say hi to everybody. Might have a pint or something. Walk in. I see him harassing two random gentlemen.
And knowing him, you're like, oh boy, what's this about, right?
Yeah, right. The Irish, especially our dear friend, they can be a little rambunctious. So I had to see what was going on.
Yeah.
And I'm really surprised that I actually put my attention on the paper first. I don't know why I saw your name written down, Daniel Dumbrill, and that's when the little light bulb went off in my head. I said, "Oh, you gotta watch his stuff. You gotta start looking at all that." And when he told me, "Oh, would you like to meet him?" And you're sitting right there, I couldn't believe it. I don't know. Maybe I think you had you hadn't shaved or something in a few days or something like that. Yeah. You're undercover. You're undercover out in public. So.
I've been recognized a few times there, and the thing that was interesting to me was because most of them are people in their 30s, 40s, and stuff like that. But how old are you?
I'm 23.
23. Yeah. And so to see somebody so politically active, it's kind of it gives a little bit of hope also, because sometimes you don't think that a lot of the younger generation who has been indoctrinated really understands geopolitics or what they've been co-opted into. And so that was really encouraging. And then we had a lot of conversations after that. We were talking about whether it's Trump or Harris, no matter which, or at least beforehand, no matter what party gets in, it's like doing donuts in a parking lot.
Exactly.
And so I repeated that. And then you had somebody else who said, hey, hold on a second. You want to tell that story?
Yeah. No, I actually have a bunch of friends back in the States and Canada who are familiar with you, who watch your content online. And when you use that analogy that I had mentioned before, doing the donuts in a parking lot, that political just constant just cycle of rinse and repeat. You know, when they saw that, they sent that to me, and they're kind of like, "Oh, interesting." And I said,
"He's saying the same thing you say."
Yeah, exactly. And so there was kind of this moment where I kind of had to explain to them, like, "Oh, I've met this guy." And they're just blown away. So
not only you met him, but you're the reason I was saying that phrase.
Exactly. It's quite an honor.
No, it's interesting, and so what I want to maybe a good place to start is like why you. Let's start with why you left the U.S. Like, I'm kind of curious if it's related to just being a little bit disillusioned with the whole situation in the U.S., or it was just you just wanted to get out and experience the world. Like, what is it that prompted you to say, "All right, I'm getting out for a bit"?
That's a really good question. I recently graduated from university just about almost 2 years prior to this point, and there had always kind of been this drive for me to get out of the U.S., not only for the geopolitical purposes, but also, I'm a young man. I want to travel. I want to see the world. I have this heavy interest in what's going on outside of the kind of, you could probably empathize with this living in North America and growing up in North America. There's this cultural, political sphere that it's a bubble basically that you're kind of trapped in constantly. And that is in like manifest in discourse, manifest in the type of people you meet. So I had both this kind of like emotional desire to see the world, to travel, but also I wanted to not only just say, "Oh, I'm going on an adventure, I'm going to this and that location." I really wanted to educate myself. I wanted to meet people that I felt like could impact my worldview and stuff. So I remember the moment I decided to come to Asia, I was looking at either Vietnam or China because of my interest in the socialist projects that are being developed in Asia right now. And I mean, even in the West, if you're not overtly familiar with these projects or even like aware, you could still see the impact of the decisions being made, the actions being taken in the day-to-day life, not only people abroad, but also back in the States. So that's what I just had this really huge desire. And I had a lot of friends in university, especially when I started to become a bit more politically conscious. They kind of always would kind of harass me. They'd say, "Oh, well, if you're really about it, you should just move there. You should just go there."
It's like, "Oh, if you love China so much, why don't you move there?"
Exactly.
You actually did it.
Yes, exactly. And it was quite satisfying when I got to tell those specific friends that, hey, I'm moving to China, because for years, that was always in every argument or discourse discussion, they'd say, "Why don't you just go
to
there?"
troll you?
Yeah. It was very bad faith trolling, but
Right.
I said, "Okay, I'll move to China."
Yeah, exactly. But how do you get to the point where, because there's so much propaganda about China to begin with there, whether it be through media, through conversations, through even movies and things like that. Like, how do you get enough information? How do you get outside of that enough where you manage to get this other view of China? Like, what were your sources of information? Did you have to put in effort to get outside of that China bad bubble? Like, how do you get to that point?
That's a really interesting question, and I think it's especially relevant towards for a lot of people in the imperial core, the United States, Canada, etc. A lot of them who are self-proclaimed socialist, anti-imperialists, what have you. There's still this massive kind of it's very present. This kind of just like immediate response to any actual what we call actual existent socialism. When these states are brought up in discussions, it's kind of like they're immediately discounted. That's not real socialism.
Yeah.
That's not real communism. Whatever you want to say, right? So that was always really interesting for me, and I saw that very prevalent in a lot of politically active circles and organizations that I was in. A lot of them, these were great people doing great work, very involved in their community, but their whole, I think, very poorly informed analysis of what China actually is and what its system and its procedures are for building socialism were just completely, it's embarrassing, really, but it was just completely devoid of any context, historically, cultural context, and also there was just not a lot of there wasn't a lot of information, really, and it was almost kind of left out of discussions.
Right.
It was very geocentric when we were talking about socialism, when we talked about these things, where there was never like this outward gaze towards actual socialism being developed outside of the U.S. And so for me, having been in these circles, I started to ask like questions to myself, right? Like, why do socialists or so-called socialists or just leftists, for example, in the United States, why do they have this outlook that China is not socialist? Where does that come from? And that really started to bother me because I just had all these questions. You know, I went through this political speedrun gauntlet basically of development, and I started reading a lot. There's some Friends of Socialist China was one of the first sources.
Yeah, Carlos is a part of that, right?
Yes, he is. And then we have FRSO's Jay Sykes was his write-in that he did was very informative too. And I mean, it's quite funny because I was so driven to kind of like at least come to at least some point of like understanding if that was socialism or not, right?
Right.
And what can you truly call socialism? Is it this perfect system that exists in an abstract vacuum, or is it a thing that's constantly changing and evolving? And so the more that I read a lot of political theory from like the classics, like Lenin, Marx, Engels, etc., but also like I think a really big reason that changed my attitude towards China, or at least informed my viewpoint on it, was talking to people from global South countries who were involved in their own liberation movements or national development projects. We could use like Burkina Faso, for example. I started to kind of listen to these voices, and not that they were all just like across the board same. There's a lot of discrepancies. There's a lot of disagreements amongst the various positions.
Yeah.
But that's when I really started to see that there was this really, like, especially in the discourse in the West, so much information and so much effort was not put into understanding this stuff. So I think once I started listening to people from the global South, once I started reading not only the like classical theory, but also just seeing what's being done today, like Tricontinental Institute, Vijay Prashad.
Yeah.
These were the voices and the sources that really started to change my outlook. But most importantly, it was really just talking to people from colonized oppressed nationalities in the United States, as well as just talking to people abroad. So I think that was a big turning point, was reaching out and asking for this information and not just going in kind of with like a finger wag and going, that's not real socialism or that's not right.
Well, that's really interesting because sometimes I always ask the question with these like Friends of Socialist China, Tricontinental, all these different organizations. I always wonder, does it actually reach people in the West and make an impact, or is it just they're speaking to people they already have on board? But it sounds like that was really important in your transition and understanding what's really going on. Yeah, I mean, because I kind of gave up a little bit where I thought I wanted people in the West to understand that they were given, they were not being given the full story. Mm-hmm. And eventually I kind of gave up on it because I thought, first of all, I kind of lost hope in that even being possible. But second of all, I feel like it's becoming less and less important because the global South is finding their own way without these imperialist countries, holding them down anymore. And I thought that, well, that's where it really matters anyways. But to see you come to these conclusions and to reach out to people, it sounds like the work that these people do actually is really important for bringing people over into the light and to understand the real situation.
It's a really important aspect of strategic development for these projects, for these organizations and institutes, of course. How do we who do we reach out to? Who do we educate? And I absolutely agree with the sentiment of like, a lot of there is Western chauvinism kind of embodied in a lot of even these so-called radical circles, socialist circles, that we're going to be the ones that change things. We are going to be leading, and it's not even like an explicit like, oh, we're the most important or we're at the forefront. It's more so just this. And it's hard to explain the mentality of that. You live in the belly of the beast, right? You're in this machine and you are so embedded within it that it feels like almost that if you don't do something in that context, then like to change that situation, then nothing's going to happen. But I think that also it's really interesting because I see the work that you do. I see the work that like Tricontinental, other media organizations, any project really that is based around this type of education. I think it's not only important for people in the West, but also a lot of people from these peripheral nations, global South countries, because we see the propaganda machine from the United States that is just so powerful. So I think it'd be very unwise to think that it only affects the perceptions of people in the imperial core, because that is not true. You'll have so many people from these countries that have been subjugated by U.S. imperialism repeat the same talking points and have the same kind of ideological consistency with the empire. And that is, I mean, that's just the matter of the fact that the media is so powerful. So it's and it's really interesting because we have so many just brilliant I feel like I'm using a naughty word here, but like content creators, right? Like people who are going out of their way to tell these stories, to have these discussions. That could feel really, for some people that could feel like that's banal, but I think it's really important because especially once you gain an international audience of sorts, you're bringing the discussion to a bigger group of people, and you're having these groups of people from all over the world have these discourses, have these discussions. So I think it's really interesting.
That's a really good point, because actually a lot of people who have watched my content from China, they've actually said, even though they live here in China, they've always lived in China, I've changed their perspective on China.
Exactly.
And because, I mean, there's a lot of the grass is always greener on the other side. And more so before than now, there was a lot of kind of holding Western systems of governance, holding it up on a pedestal and saying, oh, this is what we should aspire for. Now that's changing a little bit, but some of my content was saying, well, no, it isn't so black and white like this. Actually help people within these countries.
Exactly.
And I think some of that is, obviously being able to look at the situation from the outside, from a third view. And I think that's what's going to be important for you too, is because now that you've left the U.S. also, you can also examine the U.S. from outside of it all. Because once you're, when you're inside of it, I guess sometimes it's hard to see past a lot of the BS that's going on around you. I mean, so I'm kind of curious, like, how did you start off in politics? Did you start off in politics with a lot more hope about the way that your system works, or is the whole reason you got into politics because you said something's broken with our system? Like, did you start out as a typical kind of I vote Democrat and stuff like that, and this is and then slowly you became disillusioned with the system? Or, like I said, did you get involved just from the beginning because you're like, man, something's messed up here?
That's a really good question. I was raised in a vaguely libertarian family, I guess you could say. So there's always this this kind of attitude of distrust towards authority. Of course, there's a lot of incomplete aspects of that, but I always had this kind of negative attitude towards, especially I grew up in a kind of rather conservative area in the United States, and there was always kind of this feeling of something was off, right?
Yeah.
But I never really considered myself a Democrat. I was one of those guys back in 2016, 2020 that was like Bernie or bust, and that was because that is what is considered the most, I guess, acceptable framework. Like you can only argue within this specific range, and in anything too far to the left or too far outside of what is considered politically normal it's absolutely taboo. I think it was during the 2020 election, and of course the George Floyd protests, that we saw so many people who had vested so much of their interest and even lots of money. Like lots of people were donating to these campaigns because especially the Bernie campaign, because they felt they were quite close to achieving some goals of like a vague social democratic system that was not just about just pulverizing people for capital. And a lot of people during the 2020 election and the protests that were going on, I think that was a big moment for them and their political development. A lot of people became quite apathetic and nihilistic. I was more it stoked my curiosity and my bewilderment at the situation, seeing the political trends that were occurring in the United States at the time. And so having that background, being from a libertarian family, but also just very, I would say very just inclined towards asking questions about like, why don't we have, universal basic income? Like, why don't we have healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. Those were the things that really pushed a lot of people into voting or for being interested in candidates like Bernie. And it wasn't even this overt like ideological thing. It's not like you read a bunch of books and you're like, oh, I agree with this. It was like, I'm broke, or I have student loans. Why is this so expensive? And so it's really funny how a lot of the political development that occurred in other people was about the material aspects of it. For me, I was already at that point in 2020 where I was very much into the Bernie or bust thing. But there was just for me such a letdown in terms of how they kind of. There was really it was bust. It wasn't Bernie, and a lot of people, I think they had this reaction of towards this complete just I think it was just this collapse of hope, basically, especially even when I remember when Biden was announced as being the, the nominee for the Democratic ticket, a lot of people were just kind of shaking their heads in bewilderment. And you saw a, like a large group of people just go, okay, anybody but Trump, right? That was very, very big. But also you had a lot of people who were kind of just like, what? Like, we have Biden as our, and so that's our guy. And it was really funny. And at that point, I was already getting into, I started reading more. I was getting into labor organizing, community organizing, and it started out very vaguely leftist. I was trying to just absorb as much as possible, but I still started to find just a bunch of inconsistencies with the belief systems and the actions of these various groups. And I mean, wherever you find yourself on the spectrum, if you're left and stuff, I was very much disenchanted with a lot of the lack of organization, the lack of concrete analysis that I saw in these left groups in the West, and specifically their attitude towards global South countries and non-Western countries. Again, you could probably empathize with this too. When everybody would use that hot word socialism, they weren't talking about China, they weren't talking about Vietnam, they weren't talking about Cuba, they were talking about the Scandinavian model. So it's really interesting how it's both like geocentric and very much culturally focused on like Europe and the United States. So I think really seeing the comparison of what was going on in China and outside of the country, and then what was going on in the imperial core was a huge factor for how I got to this point. Yeah, it's really interesting.
I mean, it is interesting to see a lot of these people who want to achieve socialism and how they can look at China and see the success that they had with poverty alleviation, with all of this stuff, with all of the things that they want to accomplish, but still say, "Oh no, we can't look at China." Like that's a no-go zone.
Yeah, it's bizarre.
So I guess that must have been one of the things that you're trying to reconcile. Also, you got all these organizations that are trying to accomplish the same things that China has accomplished, but they're just so caught up in all of the propaganda that no, you can't even do that. You're gonna just be whatever it is, a CCP sympathizer or whatever it is, as soon as you even try to say, hey, guys, maybe we can learn some lessons about what they're doing here. And there's things that they could have done that would fit within their political system also. It's not like you need to adopt China's way of politics.
Exactly.
The basic principles and formula for poverty alleviation could have easily been done in the U.S.
Yeah, no, and it's really, again, there's that kind of, I guess that brings up the topic of also just like having this, you could almost call it like ideological aesthetics, like having this like appearance of being socialist or appearance of being radical. But then when we put these ideas into practice that a lot of these so-called leftist or socialist groups champion, nothing occurs, and actually has a lot of the opposite of the intended consequences. Like you see a lot of negative consequences occur with this. And I think it's really weird too, because I mean, you don't even have to be ideologically inclined to this or that, and you could still I encounter so many Westerners who travel here, who live here, and they're not entirely politically developed or conscious or whatever, but they can still just see the immense difference in the societal standards between their home countries in the West and then China. So I think that's always been really interesting, is this whole idea that, I mean, a lot of people come here and it actually their first time having a political awakening on that level is by being dropped into China, just like, toss them in the deep end of the pool. And so it was really interesting coming here already having this, I'd say like a positive critical analysis of China's socialist development and stuff. That didn't, of course, blind me from like, obviously there's contradictions and everything, but that didn't blind me to the fact that there was a bunch of, things that need to be worked on, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the whole idea, is that nothing's perfect. There's no perfect system. There's always contradictions in every circumstance. But it was really interesting coming here and already being very ideologically and politically motivated to learn as much as possible about that. So that was kind of like, when you asked me earlier what my reasons were for coming here, it was definitely, yes, the material aspects. Like life in the West is, it's tough for a lot of people. It's the least amount tough for me in comparison to so many people. Right. College educated, I come from a good home and stuff. But I think the whole idea that I could go abroad and not only learn things and travel, but also like have these educated moments by seeing this progress, it just seemed kind of like stupid not to do. So that was really interesting coming here with all these ideas in mind and stuff, instead of just being like, oh, I'm moving to China. There was definitely that desire to move here and to see it in action. It's been mind-blowing, honestly.
What's your ultimate goal for coming here when you do this? Like, I mean, do you go back and try to, basically apply some of the things that you've learned to try to provoke change, or like or are you kind of just figuring it out still as you go along?
I definitely came over here with the intention of spending enough time to learn the culture, like learn the cultural aspects. Obviously, the language, which is the language aspect is probably the most trying and difficult for foreigners coming here, but it's really rewarding step by step. And I have so many people that have been here for even just a couple of years, and they're really good at speaking Chinese. But that is actually part of the thing too, is I want to be able to actually talk to the people. And of course, I have friends who are in the party. I have associates, colleagues who are politically active here. And so I'm able to talk to them, but really talking just to the average everyday people is one of the most important parts. So yeah, I guess when I came over here, there was this whole focus on like social investigation, class analysis, understanding things. I never came over here with the desire to stay here for the rest of my life.
Right.
I easily could. It's a fantastic country. I love living here. I've only been here like less than a year, and it's just mind blowing how different it is in so many positive aspects in comparison to the US. But it's my hope and my desire to, use the connections, the friendships, and also the lessons I've learned here as a way to like at least get the work done back in the United States, where I'd feel like I'm most capable of being a part of change. It wasn't like I was going to come over here and just walk into a party school and say, "Hey, you guys need help." No, it was like, I truly came over here with the intention of learning as much as possible, with keeping an open mind, with talking to people, and I really hope to return to the U.S. at one point before too long, so we could. So much great work going on there right now. I know it's especially for us over here. We kind of like have this. We kind of like see the. A lot of the actions and the organizations or parties in the imperial core, they kind of can seem a little anemic. You feel me? But I think there's so much great work being done and stuff by a lot of these members, a lot of these people, and so to use the knowledge and experiences I have here in at least trying to build something, putting that effort in back in the West in the United States, I think is very important. And I think that is more and more so. I think that's becoming a thing that a lot of people are doing from the West. I think they're wanting to come here not only for their own personal experience and education, career development, et cetera, but they feel like they can come here and learn these things, and then they could return back to their home countries and use those lessons and apply it to their context.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious. Like, I want to get to like what it is you've actually learned so far, but for people who are interested, like who are kind of in the same boat, and they're like, and I just got to get out and see the world or something like that. Like, how did the process work in terms of you? First of all, well, you decided on China. Then what happens next? Like, what do you do? How do you get over here? Let's start with that. Like, well, how did that work? And how did you choose Chongqing, also of all places?
Yeah, no, those are really good questions. It was honest. It's one of the most mentally taxing processes that I've done in my life. It was so much paperwork, so much research into the whole thing. Once I knew I wanted to move to China, I kind of was already hip to the fact that teaching was like the biggest market pull, so lots of people come here to teach. Luckily, I have had
teaching language, teaching English,
teaching language, yes. And there's many people come over here and they could teach science and math if they're qualified in English or international schools. But I've always been fascinated with linguistics, language, communication at large. So that was a really big part of me wanting to get over here. And I love teaching. It's so rewarding. There's just so many moments, especially for what we were just discussing, like these learning experiences, these lessons, and you get those in the form of interaction with your students, But I had my heart set on teaching and coming to China, and so the process was simple, but it was complicated. So I had to interview. I went online and I went to all the recruitment websites and just like crawled through the slop of recruitment for about a month and a half. I made a CV, I had my demo lessons, and so I was quite prepared with that. But then it was really just like picking which city you're going to move to. I'm frankly like I didn't even know Chongqing existed like a little over a year ago, and that is embarrassing because it's just an insanely cool city. Like it's mind blowing. But I was looking at first off, I said, okay, play it safe, Beijing, Shanghai. But then the more I kept looking, I said, what's further west? And especially in terms of the poverty alleviation campaigns being focused on the inland parts of China. That was really interesting to me, and I thought it'd be really valuable to be situated close to that geographically if I wanted to go witness that. So that was on the back of my mind, and I interviewed. I think I did maybe like 4 or 5 dozen interviews. I was really picky about where I was going to go. I wanted to make my experience over here as smooth as possible. And randomly, I just looked on a map one day and I saw Chongqing, and I said, never heard of that.
Yeah.
So I clicked on it, and then you get the typical like cyberpunk city, and that, and I said, whoa, that's crazy. I saw the population being above the tens of millions. I saw the insane architecture, and I'm kind of like an urbanist, I love big cities, and so that was I was instantly drawn to it. So yeah, I think 2 or 3 weeks into doing this process of recruitment and interviews, I was like, Chongqing. So I kept telling the recruiters, I said, hey, I want to go to Chongqing. They'd say, how about this city? I go, no, Chongqing. Like I was very
set. Like it was like,
yes,
this is the place I got to go.
I needed it. And it was really weird that I'd never felt so like focused on being like anything like that before. Like most times it could be like, yeah, I could go here, I could go there, I'll be fine. But no, I was really interested in Chongqing. And I think it was also, again, like I mentioned the poverty alleviation, but also how Chongqing has kind of become this like economic mecca in the Southwest. That is just, there's so many people coming here, not only from in China, but from abroad to pursue entrepreneurial projects, open businesses, so many things. And so it felt like this really cool, like Timbuktu crossroad for me that I could just go experience. And so finally I got a job here and I was just ecstatic. I said, yes, we're going. And that whole preparation process was mainly working with my school, but also I hired a third party to manage my documents and stuff.
Visa and stuff like that.
Yeah. And it's really interesting is that's like on the personal level of like that experience, but it's become easier and easier for foreigners to come to China. And I think China is very not only open to this idea and aware of it, but also motivated by it because it's just, how they are, that they want to increase their relationships with not only other countries, but individuals and communities from these nations. And so that's been a big thing, is really just trying to open up the country more and more. So actually, when I started, I think they just actually joined the Hague Convention, but they used to have this way more complicated process of notarizing documents, et cetera, et cetera. And as you remember, and now they joined the apostille system. The United States and China now are both on the apostille system, so that was so much easier. So it was just the perfect timing, And post COVID, there's a lot of desire to get the economy back into full swing and stuff. And so there's just this big, like, it kind of seemed like a gold rush of sorts. And so I said it'd be stupid to miss out on this opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, they're doing the visa free for a lot of countries now too. Yeah. And I mean, the result is there's a lot of content creators that came to China also. And when they start filming and stuff like that, whether it's here or especially in places like Xinjiang, and they're like, this place is amazing. It's nothing like I ever imagined and stuff like that. And now there's a scramble, a mad rush from the Western media to say, oh, these guys are all, sponsored by the government. But it's like, it's logical that when you finally come here and you see it with your own eyes, that you're going to just, say it like it is. It's been for the longest time where even there was a period last year that the U.S. was trying to prohibit Americans from going to Xinjiang, for example. They had this thing saying, oh, we shouldn't allow, that to happen, while they were trying to sell this narrative about oppression in Xinjiang, right? And meanwhile, it is the Xinjiang authorities and China saying, come to Xinjiang and see it for yourself. So it's like, okay, that's very telling. It's like the guys who want you to believe these wild stories don't want you to go and see it for yourself. And the ones who are apparently committing these wild things are saying, no, come and see it for yourself.
It's ridiculous.
It's really crazy. But when you decided you were going to come here, were there any people like friends or family and stuff like that where they're like, you're just crazy, man? What are you thinking? Was there any of that, or were they, It
was really interesting because I had a few, I'm despite my political beliefs and stuff, I've never, unless it was like a really specific serious circumstance, I don't like to alienate people around me. I think that's a stupid way to also get people to not listen to you. But I had a few former coworkers, friends, colleagues, fellow students at my old university who I was in touch with, and some of them ranging from kind of milquetoast, typical liberal, to some of them actually being quite conservative. And, what's funny is I had, besides like the classic, stupid like jokes about China and stuff, I had more Western liberals actually kind of raise their eyebrows at me when I said I was moving here. Isn't it interesting? It's weird.
You would think it would be the opposite.
Yeah, no. And I had like conservative family members say, "Oh, that's incredible. You're going to China. Like, tell me how it is and stuff." I've always been interested in it. And even them, I just show them videos of Chongqing or like the public transport system here, etc. And I kind of feel like it broke their brain. Like, I think a lot of them kind of had this like weird like reaction mentally. They're like, "Whoa, like that's real." And especially a lot of them kind of being a little bit older who saw China in its early years of development in like the 50s, 60s, and 70s, et cetera. A lot of them hadn't really been paying attention to it, or they had just been completely mentally removed from their day-to-day lives. But when I show them these videos, especially from a lot of the people that are coming here, the content creators, they just couldn't believe it. But I mainly had a lot of Western liberals that I know that I'm still friends with kind of raise their eyebrows at me and say like, "Really? Why not Japan?" So that's the classic one in the West. Yeah, it's you could show a picture of any place, and if you say location X Japan, everybody's like, "Cool," but you say location X China, and people start getting rabid and screaming. It was a really funny litmus test, though. I was really expecting the conservative friends and family and colleagues of mine to kind of wag their finger, but I didn't really get much of that. Maybe a few comments here and there, but it was never like this overt like opposition towards it compared to like a lot of my liberal friends. And so that was really funny. It's bizarre.
It is weird seeing this whole thing like where you would think beforehand the people on the left would be typically a little bit more pragmatic and you could have a conversation with them, but it's actually kind of shifted. It's kind of shifted where of course the Republicans, they have their neocons and stuff like that in their ranks who want war with China. But when you're talking about ordinary people on the right, I'm finding it increasingly more easy to have a conversation with them, or for them to say, "Oh, maybe things aren't like," you see like Tucker Carlson, obviously he's a China hawk, but on the Russia-Ukraine situation, he's willing to be a little bit more open-minded with, okay, what's the actual situation, and not necessarily follow what his specific party says. And the liberals are just, they're the ones who are really set in their ways. And even to the point where they end up sounding like right-wingers, after they lost, suddenly they were the ones turning on minorities and blaming Latinos and black males and all of this stuff. And Fetterman even came out and said that, so Muslims voted for Trump, eh? I hope you like your new Muslim ban. It's like, hold on a second, what's going on? They're starting to sound like who you would typically associate with the right. And I think that's why you've lost so many people like Joe Rogan and all of these people, not because they're right-wingers, but because they're like, okay, this is where we can actually have the conversation. I don't know if you're like kind of seeing the same kind of a thing.
I actually, I totally agree. And despite obviously my, belief that both like these, for lack of a better term, these liberals and conservatives are both, respectively foxes and wolves, as Malcolm X said. But
donuts in the parking lot.
Exactly,
like you said,
donuts in the parking lot. But it's Coca-Cola and Pepsi. But for random, just normal day-to-day people who are voters, who are people who have to go to their jobs or 9 to 5, who worry about their bills, putting their kids through school and everything like that, I noticed that there's now, and it's because the Republicans just followed the playbook in the election. They, the Harris campaign, that's a whole diatribe there, but just like seeing just how disconnected and detached from their constituents they were, how just the finger wagging that occurred constantly, especially to these people that aren't even, you wouldn't even call left. They're just, they're maybe left-leaning liberals, especially who are very upset, rightfully so, about the genocide in Palestine. They when they were just basically just shoved to the ground and said, what are you going to do about it by the Democratic Party? That was a big moment for a lot of people, and I think it's kind of almost like a second part to what occurred in 2020. Is seeing this political decay occurring. Meanwhile, the Republicans were very much, despite the fact that they say one thing and do another, they still say the things that people want to hear.
That's the thing.
Yeah, exactly. They have an appeal. And it's pseudo-populist or something like that. But at the end of the day, when we saw this rightward swing with a lot of people, it was because of material circumstances. And it was also from the fact that it felt like the Democratic Party, as you mentioned to me before, in these kind of more mainstream liberal circles, completely shut people out of the conversation. A lot of purity testing, a lot of kind of moral high ground and that was occurring and stuff. And so average day-to-day people who aren't college educated, who may not have like completely correct ideas and stuff, they were just completely left to the wayside. And sorry to say, that's a lot of people in the United States, because now obviously the propaganda factors and all that stuff, but also just the material stuff. You don't have time to sit down and read Howard Zinn like after like your 4 hours of work at your university. Like you have to go to your lumber mill job. You have to drive your truck across the country. And so like these are just it's really interesting how so many people from kind of the what we call the professional managerial class and the intelligentsia were so, who are very, bleeding heart liberals. A lot of them at the end of the day were just completely, both them and also the people they voted for, completely disconnected from the material realities for Americans and the world at large. And at least I think a lot of people who call themselves conservative or Republican, yes, they have a lot of ideas I disagree with, but they have more of a, I think that a lot, and this isn't all Republicans, and there's many people who vote Democrat that have these same ideas, but it was how the Republican Party was able to kind of placate to them just a little bit without actually doing anything. They just followed the basic rules of like any candidacy, any election. You want to like at least make people like you, but the Democrats were just so alienating. So I feel like this is definitely like a part 2 of 2020. Yeah, it's really interesting.
I mean, I think the Democrats reached a level of lack of self-awareness and condescension towards their own people that it was just it was so hard to ignore. Where they knew they had a massive base that was against the actions in Israel. And their answer was more or less, I know you guys are upset that we're, helping to commit this genocide, but Trump will be worse. It's like, that's not a good answer. It's like, how about you stop this? There's the majority of their voters wanted them to stop, yet in this political system where the people are supposed to have the power, there was no way to vote. There was no reasonable way to vote against genocide.
Yeah.
And they were just expecting to still be rewarded, even though that it started under them, it continued under them, and it continued to get worse. And I mean, at the end of the day, if you think that Trump is all of these things to minorities and he calls all Latinos, murderers and rapists and stuff like that, which is what they were trying to sell. They're saying this is what he thinks of you, and they showed up in record numbers for him. You would think that would be the point of self-reflection, where it's like, hold on a second, we're trying to tell them that this is what Trump thinks of you, and even though that, they're still willing to vote for a guy who calls them this than us. It's like, when do they start self-reflecting? And I don't think, I mean, the wrap-up afterwards, like I said, just assigning blame to everyone else, it doesn't look like that reconciliation is happening.
It's ridiculous. It was really mind-boggling, especially I masochistically logged onto Reddit just to see what was being pumped out by the mainstream sources, and it was just these horrendous takes from liberal media, saying Latino men weren't ready for a woman president. I said, really? What's going on south of the border right now in Mexico with the Morena party? Yeah, and like with Claudia. And that was that really blew my mind when I saw that. And then I kept going, and of course too, like a lot of the people blaming the constituents in Dearborn, Michigan, which is a very high, Muslim, and our
that's where Fetterman said, "I hope you enjoy your next Muslim ban," like blaming them. Yeah,
it's ridiculous. No, and it's just, I mean, it's really bizarre because it's like this goldfish memory almost that they have. Like this, like they say one thing, and then 15 seconds later, it just completely changes. And so it was so bizarre that the moment the election results were pretty much like concrete, solid, like Trump's going to win, they just tossed it out the window and they went back to their just like disgust and chauvinistic racism. That it was mind-boggling, because even some people I knew, again, masochist here, I went onto social media and I was just checking my accounts and I just saw some insane takes, like meltdowns from these a lot of people, and a lot of them were white, middle class, upper class people, and it was mind-boggling to see how mask off they'd become with this kind of just this vitriol against minorities, against oppressed groups. And it was just because they were upset. But then at the same time, this is coming from like a section of the population, a social strata that isn't as affected by these changes as these other groups are. Yet they are the ones who are the loudest, and they weren't directing that at the political system. They weren't directed at the politicians, the parties. It was basically pointing their finger at their fellow citizens or just fellow humans in general. So that was really mind-blowing.
It almost crazy. Embodied like what I see as the difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, where the Democrat Party, they're really good at pretending to be somebody they're not.
Mm-hmm.
You know, whether, you know, especially when it comes to foreign policy, you know, they go around saying, well, this is why we're doing it. It's a moral position. Whereas at least Trump, especially Trump, there's no mistaking where he stands on a lot of stuff. Like I remember before when he was leaving troops in Syria, he just kept saying over and over, we're leaving troops for the oil. We like oil. We're taking their oil. And that's what he kept saying. How hard is it for the Democratic Party then afterwards, once they're back in, to reinvent the reason why they're still in Syria? He kind of messed it up for people. And so the mask off moment with a lot of Democrat supporters was that all of a sudden these people who are tolerant of minorities and all of this kind of stuff, their mask dropped also for that moment. Exactly. Where they're like, okay, we're going to blame the minorities for this now. Again, we're not going to self-reflect. We're not going to see what's wrong. But they became what people on the right often just openly admit they are. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people, this is what Assad said also after he was making the comments about Syria. He said Trump is the best president we could ever hope for because he just says what he means. He says he's here for our oil.
No second
He's
guessing.
not like these presidents that win a Nobel Peace Prize and go on to become a war criminal. Mm-hmm. And so for me, somebody who I try not to say, where I am on the political spectrum, but I'm definitely not, supportive of the right traditionally. I actually I'm not as bothered by Trump's second win because, first of all, nobody deserved to lose as much as the Democrats did this time, and afterwards their reaction just reinforced that to everybody. Exactly. Everybody who they alienated through their condescension, they basically validated their decision afterwards. So there's part of that, but with Trump, I almost feel like he's such a wild card when. We're stuck doing donuts in a parking lot all the time. He is potentially the only person who could be kind of the wrench that you throw into the system that just messes things up. Yeah. Worst case scenario, we still get more of the same. Mm-hmm. Imperialism, foreign wars, all this kind of stuff. Best case scenario, with all of his supposed plans to release the FBI files, the Twitter file style FBI files, to release all these things, to go after the deep state. I don't know if he's going to do it or not, but even if there's a very, very small chance of that, maybe it's worth betting on that because that there's 0% chance of that with Kamala. She would just basically preserve the pre-existing systems. Mm-hmm. I don't know how you feel about what you saw unfolded.
I actually agree with you. That's why so many people, part of the political establishment, both more mainstream Republicans and Democrats, are just so bewildered and afraid of Trump because, again, he's not this. He's a symptom of the current social circumstances that we're in. It's not just this one man, obviously, but he represents this decay and what's occurring in this political and social decay in the imperial core, and that's terrifying. But it's more so is when this man and his group go into action. Obviously, he is, still it's terrifying no matter if you have a Democrat or Republican in power. We've seen what Democrats do. We saw how the pipeline protest. We saw the Democrats during Biden's term. Look how they treated the Palestinian protesters on campus. It was absolutely insane. I think that I absolutely agree with you. They're just afraid of Trump, though, because he is not the super, I guess you could say, professional manager of empire. Right. You understand? He is a lot more kind of, I would say, discombobulated in a lot of ways.
It says the quiet bits out loud,
yes,
too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Way more frequently than the Democrats do. And so that's terrifying because with him, the mask fell instantly the moment he got into his first term in the White House. There was no doubt about what his intentions were. But I absolutely, most people, I feel like, too, especially so many of us who have weathered the 2016 election, 2020, 2024. And that's when 2016 was when a lot of people actually got more radicalized because after Occupy fizzled out at the turn of the 2010s and there's just basically it fell off. It said, okay, we have Obama for another 4 years. That was really interesting to see when that kind of the fire was kind of re-soaked, and so that's been continuously going on, I feel like, since 2016. And then now that we're at 2024, I feel like there's just less and less kind of vested interest in even seeing how the election goes. I remember I checked online and there was a large amount of people who didn't even know that Biden dropped out. And so that should be kind of this really big indicator of where people are at, normal people are at in regards to how they view the political system. And it's really I would absolutely agree with your how your viewpoint that it's not going to be this massive difference. We've been here before.
Right.
We've seen that no matter who's in power, the Republicans or the Democrats, this downward spiral on the social level inside the imperial core, but also insane foreign policy that is totally directed at subjugating other countries and destroying alternatives to the U.S. imperialist model.
Trump just came out yesterday and said that he's going to impose 100% tariffs on anybody who's following this BRICS model and will come out with their own currency. It's like, and on one hand, he's talking about how powerful and essential the U.S. dollar is to the world. This is like the number one currency, but now they have to threaten people to continue using it.
I think it's really interesting.
And this is good. Like, you know what? Like that, although that is a bad thing for the global South in the short term, these are the kinds of things that I appreciate because it's full mask off.
Exactly.
It's like, it's not that, okay, use the US dollar because it's a good value proposition. It's like, no, use it or we're going to punish you.
It's a temper tantrum from the empire. And I think that's really, again, I agree. It's good because not only a lot of people who might be on the fence, so to speak, in these peripheral countries or in the global South, especially a lot of the intelligentsia, a lot of them who have access to this Western media and discourse, I feel like that is one of the biggest slaps in the face to any assumption that the U.S. empire or its political system, social systems actually work for people. And that's a lot of people on the left will argue, about what this means now that we have somebody who's almost kind of like a political accelerationist in the position of power. Like, is this going to, like you said, there's going to be a lot of drawbacks short term, but long term, it just continually isolates the U.S. And we've been watching this since, the turn of the century. You know, like we've seen the U.S., especially in regards to Iraq, we've seen the U.S. become increasingly more isolated on its levels of foreign relations, especially with the global South. Africa's pivot to China and China's their collaborative projects through the Belt and Road Initiative, it's dealt a huge blow to the empire because now there is an alternative that isn't just say you must subjugate yourself to us, but it's more about cooperation. It's more about autonomy and also the fact that with this mutual cooperation, we're all getting things that we want. We want jobs. We want our families to be able to eat, to go to school, to have clean drinking water, to have electricity, all these things. And to not be trapped into this overtly predatory system like with the IMF, the World Bank, et cetera, that is, and to just have that as a clear alternative.
Right.
It's terrifying to finance capitalists in the West. It's terrifying to the military industrial complex because now there's very little that they can do now to I think we're past this point of the U.S. being able to kind of play these tricks with all these economic schemes. I think that is long gone. We're kind of entering this new epoch of seeing the multipolar world, as they call it, kind of develop further and further. And obviously there's going to be a bunch of bumpy road. It's a bumpy road, twists and turns, right? But I still see this in a very overwhelmingly positive light that there is an alternative now that is very apparent and it's being championed. And it's not even about spreading socialism. It's about just cooperation at the end of the day. China doesn't want to impose its system on anybody. It doesn't seek to. It just says, hey, let's build.
Well, that's exactly what the president of Argentina said, who is obviously going to be very well aligned with Trump. And before he got elected, he said, China's out. We can't deal with them. We're not going to deal with them. And just like a few days ago, he said, you know what? We got to increase our trade with China because they come in, they buy our stuff, and there's no conditions. They don't ask us to do anything. That's completely opposite from when the IMF goes in and they say you need to restructure the way your economy works in such a way that it's going to benefit Western corporations. So even their own allies are waking up. when the American allies who say that they're going to enforce the ICC's decision on Netanyahu to arrest him if he, for example, goes to Canada. The U.S. also threatens their own allies, saying, if you do that, if you follow international law like that, there's going to be penalties from us. They're alienating even their own allies now. It's just becoming more and more clear. And again, that's what I like about Trump is he makes it more obvious, more quick. People have slowly been realizing this over time. But he is like a direct injection of education on, oh man, we really need to find some alternatives.
Absolutely.
And even in these global South countries, the fact that it's not a unipolar world anymore, they have these two powers that they can play off of each other. Even if they're going to play China, I'm totally supportive of that because finally the global South has an option where they can come out ahead. They can, have better conditions now. It's just been long overdue.
Absolutely. No, and I think also too, look what that is just a great example of China's economic soft power was, you know, the leader of Argentina going out saying all these things about, oh, we're not going to work with these dirty communists, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly,
and then just like not too long afterwards, they show up and it's like China doesn't like wag their finger. They don't scold them or anything. They
there's
just
no
say,
conditions.
There's no conditions.
It's just like, we do business. That's it.
That's a great like display of how their model is and how successful it's been. Is like you just had a, you know, this nut job in Argentina just come out here, say all this crazy stuff, and then not too long afterwards, there's the deals with China, and so it's great.
It was crazy. I mean, it was crazy when you saw it. It's like, what is wrong with this guy? I mean, this is a guy who's living under a country that is covered by the Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah,
that the U.S. calls their own backyard and basically polices what they do and don't do. And China's the problem. It's like, what's going on? But he came to his senses. Imagine that this guy, this crazy guy in Argentina, came to his senses while you've got a lot of other Western leaders who look on paper to be a little bit more sane than him, who still don't get it.
I think it's also like in comparison to the dire economic situation in Argentina. I mean,
how could they just cut off the, you know?
I think at that point, I mean, if he didn't make a deal with China, I think that would I can't speak like concretely on it because that would be, you know, we'll never know. But I still think that's really interesting to think about what would have happened if he didn't do that. It would have probably I think it probably would have accelerated the downturn a lot more, and then he probably would have just gone to China at the end. But I think just China coming in at the right moment and just saying, hey, yeah, we'll make a deal. That's that. No stipulations that are like that you might not like. I think this is perfect. And so I think, again, that is just an awesome like display of the economic soft power that China's developed. It's something that I don't think anybody, especially from your generation, expected to see in the 2020s, of this like this ability to use economic development, social development, and mutual cooperation in such a way that was powerful for a country's project, but also beneficial to other people. It is quite literally a win-win. So I think it's there's a lot of like lessons that we could learn off of that too, especially in the West. And obviously we're nowhere near obviously the development of like socialism in the West. That goes without saying in comparison to China. But I'm very interested to see how people in the West can take these lessons from the more big picture geopolitical developments within these countries, but also the stories of the lives that these have impacted. This isn't just smart geopolitical plays to maintain like power and stuff. No. This is about actually like a genuine interest in uplifting humanity and stuff, which is what I think is so inspiring and genuine to people. And I mean, the poverty alleviation campaign was one of the most incredible feats that's ever been achieved in human history, and it's still ongoing, of course. But even just that initial phase, like hundreds of millions of lives radically altered and changed in such a short amount of time, like truly a short amount of time. And the blood, sweat, and tears like that went into that from so many of the, especially the party cadres that, you know, left their families to go live in the countryside, to live in these completely different areas. That is something that I think we really, especially in the West, need to look at, not just saying like, oh, the strategic aspects of this, but really the spiritual aspects of that, if I could say that, like spiritual aspects of what it means to put this work in, to sacrifice your own desires, your own life and stuff to like change these things, to change humanity around you. And it's really inspiring. And I think that is, there's a lot of pessimism, doomerism about the political situation, and of course, climate change and stuff. And it's very silly to, think that things are just going to be all, rosy. It's not going to be rosy. We have especially as I, kind of go into my next like stage of life and stuff, I'm going to see a radically different world than the one I was born in. And it's going to be very, very, very challenging for so many people, especially in the global South, to contend with a lot of these forces, with the empire in its death throes, with the advancement of climate change. But still at the same time, you see just the hard work and effort that goes in from a lot of these individuals acting under a collective. And that's something that I feel like you could look at and say it's happening. It's not just China either. It's in the the Sahel, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali. Like we're seeing these non-aligned countries or these global South countries say we're sick of this.
Right.
Let's put the work in. Let's get it done. So I think that is one of the most inspiring but also important things for people all over the world, but especially in the imperial core in Europe and North America to realize is like we have these examples to follow. We have these teachers who can give us so much information and practical experience. listen to them. So I think that's really important for us as we continue to go forward.
It'll be really interesting to see, obviously, the acceleration of an education on how the world really works when the U.S. tries to step in to stop that. Because obviously, Argentina, considering America one of their greatest allies, when Argentina deepens ties with China or creates joint BRICS projects or whatever it is, it'll be interesting to see what the reaction is or how they process it when the U.S. steps in and says, "Nope, sorry, you want to work with China? There's going to be 100% duty." It's like, well, hold on a second, because again, Argentina wasn't in good shape, and their relationship with China is going to be essential to recovering their economy. But as soon as the U.S. steps in and wants to put an end to that party, it's going to be really interesting to see how that unfolds.
Really, yeah, and I agree. And also, I have a few friends and colleagues that are Argentinian. They live down there, and with their history of like Peronism, Argentina has always been so interesting to me. I need to do more studying on it before I could speak confidently on the subject. But I honestly have been blown away by the political currents that have occurred not only in Argentina but Latin America at large. And with their history of kind of like the pink tide 2.0, et cetera, this kind of like swaying back and forth between like reactionary dictators to kind of like populist or socialist leaders. It's really interesting seeing how China will impact this region specifically. I think Africa is of a lot of interest to especially of us in the West, because now they're in this kind of dawn of really like building alternative models to the existing imperial model. But specifically with for us North Americans, with our relationship to our brothers and sisters down in the South, it's really there's a lot of, I feel like there's a lot of emotional and cultural weight to that, because like you said, the government calls Latin America America's backyard. Like China's developing that port in Peru, America's backyard. Was that like 6,000 miles away?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. I feel like seeing the developments, and since that's so geographically close and we have such a large Spanish-speaking population in the United States, I think there's a lot of eyes on what is going on in Latin America and South America at large. And so I think that with China's presence there now, with the economic and social presence, is going to really be an interesting thing to watch occur. I think that's going to be really interesting to occur. And also, like you said, another learning experience or educating experience in that will go alongside that is how the U.S. reacts to this,
right?
How the U.S. reacts to these developments, not only in Africa, but South America, Latin America, West Asia. It's really, you're seeing just a explosion in political consciousness, I think, that we have not seen in years, honestly, especially with the, what a lot of people like Fukuyama called the end of history. A lot of people said this is it. And although lots of people in the global South would disagree that that was not the end of history, a lot of people in the West still have this mentality, and even some still do, which is ridiculous to me. But I think that it's really interesting now that we get to see just this explosion in political consciousness amongst people in the imperial core. They may not obviously have the most correct ideas. They might be, they could be kind of China bashing leftist, or they could be reactionary to some extent, but people know something's up.
Right.
People, and it's because they feel it in their day-to-day life when they put gas in the tank, when they look at their student loan bills, when they go to the hospital because they like broke their finger, right? Like it's tiny things like that. It starts with the material realization. And I think there is also a moral, I would be, silly to say there's not a moral element to it, especially with just the horrendous genocide in Palestine, what's going on in the Congo. We see these things on social media, and that is also a big reason why the U.S. empire has been really, really trying to crack down on independent media. Why not even just like independent media, but people just posting and sharing things.
Yeah.
They can't, because it circumnavigates the regular channels of corporate media in the United States, and it's absolutely to the detriment of any talking points that the U.S. has. You could actually see videos of things that go on, and you could get you could see people on the ground. Like, you could call it citizen journalism. I just think it's people recording things with their phone and saying, hey, I was here. There's an example in Amsterdam with the football hooligans. I don't know. Did you see that? Yeah. They were literally they're calling it a pogrom. Like
they were trying to reinvent the reality on that one big time.
Yeah, and it was insane because you could see the video, and it's a bunch of just these crazy fascist football hooligans chanting about like raping Arab women, and it was horrifying.
But if social media didn't exist in the way it does today, everybody would have believed it.
Exactly.
Everyone would have believed that, what the mainstream media was trying to push.
Exactly.
And that was such a wake-up call also, to see the difference between what you could actually see with your own eyes from people who recorded it and posted it online with what the media was trying to say. And that's such an important awakening moment for a lot of people too. Because I mean, that's what happened to me. Was one of my big awakening moments was in Hong Kong when I could see what was happening on the ground and how the Western media was representing it. I'm like, that was a moment of awakening for a lot of people. And so this is going to be really important to continue to see stuff like this. It might be frustrating, but it's so important to see how disconnected mainstream media is from reality in order for this acceleration of an education on how the world really works.
I agree. Now, to kind of turn it on to you now. So, like, you know, I came here obviously to China with this, I guess, like, I wouldn't say set in stone, but very much politically driven by my belief system and stuff. But you mentioned to me briefly that when you first came over here, it wasn't quite like that. Can you explain that a bit more? Like,
yeah, I mean, in terms of my political awareness, yeah. I mean, you know, like, I wasn't as like I came here in 2008 and I wasn't as politically aware then. I knew something was up. Like, you know, I had these little things that happened before. Like, I remember seeing when Ron Paul was running for the Republican ticket, and he was having this debate, and he was talking about, you know, what happened on 9/11. We got to ask, why did they attack us? They didn't attack us because we're free and they want to make sure we're not free. They attacked us because we're over there and we're doing this and this and that to them. And then Giuliani stepped up and said, you know, as somebody who survived these attacks, that's the most preposterous thing I've ever heard, for you to put the blame on us. And everybody started cheering. And then Ron Paul followed up. He says, no, what the CIA taught is real. You have blowback. There are consequences to our actions. I'm like, I want to hear more of what he's saying. But he was basically being booed. And Giuliani was being cheered. I'm like, hold on a second. Something is wrong here. And I mean, I actually did. I remembered just the other day, I actually made a video, I think in 2006, 2007. It wasn't really geopolitics per se, but I remember seeing all these reports of how China was being bashed for these toys and having like lead in it or something like that. I'm like, hold on a second. These are really big brand names that are going over there and are sourcing the products and are overseeing the production and are telling them the price requirements, how low they need their price requirements, and they're the ones importing it and putting it on the shelves. And it's like, why is they're losing, they're not showing any responsibility on them and just saying, oh, it's only China. And so I made a video. I don't think I ever ended up posting it. I still have it somewhere, probably like 2005, 2006. I'm like, forget this. Okay, I'm not going to post it. But then when I came to China and I was living in China, even though I was open-minded about China, for the first number of years here, I would still believe Western propaganda on China, even though I could see with my own eyes China continually improving. And, you know, I would see these things about, oh, this leader is that, China is that. I'm like, oh, man, what a terrible country. I'm living here. I'm seeing it improving. High-speed rail is being built all over me. Subways are opening at like a rate of 100 kilometers of new line in Shenzhen for every 5 years or whatever it is. And I'm just like, yeah. And then the 2019 protests in Hong Kong, that was the kick in the nuts. That was just like, okay, oh, geez, what's wrong? And it started having me reevaluate everything I was ever told before. And I started looking at everything differently, and then that was really the true moment of awakening. Even though there were kind of inklings before that, like a lot of people look at my content and stuff like that. He must have been really politically aware from very young, but it's like no, that wasn't the case. And yeah, I mean that was, I mean everything I reevaluate. Even like, you know, a lot of foreigners here, they complain about having to use a VPN and stuff like that to get on, you know, online, or if you have a foreign SIM card, it's okay, but. Even that I look at differently. Like I was always like, why do they do this? Like what is this? It creates a more closed-minded society and stuff like that. But it ended up being the opposite, where I see that a lot of people here, they type in google.com or youtube.com and they know they can't access it. They know that there's something their government is hiding from them. Whereas in the West, you think you have all of the information and you think that you came to conclusions based on considering all of the facts at hand, and you underappreciate how much you've been manipulated into that position. So I found that actually, when you really look at it, there are people in China who are way more politically aware than people in the West are.
Exactly.
And then when you look at the situation of, like we were talking about South America and Latin America, it's amazing that they've been subjugated by the U.S. for so long, but so many of the ordinary people there believe China's the problem. They believe China's evil, and they don't actually realize the responsibility of the U.S. My mother's country of Guyana, the U.S. and the U.K. went in the 60s to create basically a racial war between the people of African and Indian descent, because Chetty Jagan, their first leader after independence, was a little bit too friendly with the Soviet Union. And that racial tension lasts to some degree until today because of what they instigated there. Yet, a lot of people in Guyana also were not really politically aware about that. The president, the now president, did an interview recently with the BBC where he mentioned that. He said, "This is your legacy, that you came in and you created divisions between us." And I was so happy to see that. But when I saw the situation happening in Hong Kong, I was kind of thinking, wow, I can almost start to imagine what it must have been like, how the people in Guyana were manipulated in order to begin rioting and create this violence towards each other. And so I thought, what if during that time Guyana had digital sovereignty? They, the media wouldn't just, it couldn't be bought out by the West, and they could publish whatever the West wanted in order to create that violence. And I look at a country like China that is a target of the West. If they just opened up completely, they would absolutely be a target of Western propaganda. I think it would win. I think it would win. I think they would create, because the West is really good at propaganda and China's crap at it. Yeah. And when you then look at the West that's supposedly completely free, and you say, well, hold on a second. As soon as they start losing narratives that even don't have anything to do with domestic policies, like, for example, they start losing the narrative on this one-dimensional view that Russia is 100% totally in the wrong and there's no other facts you need to consider. As soon as they start losing that narrative, they say, okay, it's time to block RT off of YouTube. You can't see RT in the US on YouTube anymore. Now you got to use a VPN if you want to see that. And that doesn't even have anything to do with domestic politics. Could you imagine if a foreign power was attacking and trying to foment riots in the US to the same degree that the US tries to do that overseas? You'd see a much bigger crackdown on media then. Then all of a sudden you'd realize when they can't accomplish what they want through soft power or through media or through movies or whatever it is, that's when the hammer comes down and they start putting tighter controls on it. You're seeing it more so in the UK now, where people are going to jail for what they post online.
Oh yeah.
But it's an illusion. You have freedom in the US as long as enough people are thinking what the government wants you to think.
If you don't rock the boat. If you don't rock the boat, yeah.
As soon as they start losing that, it's okay, we got to ban TikTok, we got to take RT off of this, we got to start arresting people, and I think it's going to get more and more and more strict. I think it's going to get more strict under Trump too. They're saying directly, they're basically equating, protesting the genocide in Gaza with anti-Semitism, and they're going to crack down on that, right? I think it's going to get a lot worse. So even my view of what China is doing in terms of that has also kind of been validated by the West, saying that, no, if you have this massive existential threat, and even if you don't have it in the US, even if it's just a matter of maintaining narratives on foreign policy, that's when they start to crack down on it too.
Absolutely.
They say, for example, they say they need to control TikTok because they are afraid that this government might eventually use it as a tool, even though they don't have any evidence of them doing that. Just the risk of that is enough to look at banning TikTok. Meanwhile, that the U.S. government influences social media, and even for their own domestic population. For example, when they silenced the Hunter Biden laptop story, for example, which had a massive influence on the election back then.
Oh yeah,
and so they're saying, because China might eventually use social media the way that we absolutely do use social media, we need to block it. Well, then that is a validation of foreign countries blocking basically Western media or Western controlled outlets. So that was a little bit of a long rant on, for example, the topic of censorship. But it's so easy to get into a one-dimensional view on censorship, where it's like, well, censorship is bad and China shouldn't do that, and this is what they're doing wrong. It's like, maybe it's a little bit more nuanced than that.
Absolutely.
There's obviously cons that come with that too. There's obviously negatives you can talk about that, but nobody thinks about the other side of it.
You don't think about also like the America's cultural hegemony has just been, it is something that I think we'll continue to study for hundreds of years into the future. I'm serious. Like how the development of mass media alongside this political apparatus of manufacturing consent, inventing reality, how this is played into geopolitics on the wider scale. You mentioned Latin America, and a lot of the despite being subjugated by the empire, they still have this kind of negative viewpoint towards China. It really is one of those things that you can't just look at and say to yourself like, oh well, there's no reason for the censorship, or they're obviously doing something bad. No, it's so much more complicated. And again, yeah, it's also the hypocrisy of the West because they're a lot more tricky with it. You say China's bad at their propaganda. I think also the U.S. is very good at their propaganda. I absolutely agree. And they're very good at being tricky. They're sneaky. They're sneaky. They
slip it in everywhere. Yeah.
Oh yeah. And so I think that's the biggest thing too. But again, even if you're just luckily it hasn't gone to this point yet, but I still think that the more they try to, it's like the Streisand effect, right?
Yeah.
The more you try to hide something, people are going to see, and they're like, "Why?"
It's getting obvious.
Yeah, and so again, it not only just with the propaganda and the crackdown on media and opposing viewpoints. I think like just it's the overall like now that they're starting to like kind of tough like see the protests in Germany, see how the protesters are just getting battered by the police there.
Yeah.
It's horrendous. It is disgusting. And yet at the same time, any moral superiority or validity that you might claim they have that could be, especially from a Western liberal talking point, completely out the window.
Absolutely.
It's gone. We not only on the economic level of China's development with the BRICS, but also the Belt and Road, but also just the social aspects of what is going on. We're past this point of return of being able to act like that the West is morally superior, socially superior, economically superior. It isn't, and it has never been. But now it's just so much easier to see that it isn't, because now that with not only the existence of alternate forms of media, we also have just the backlash from the state apparatuses that be towards these alternative ways of thinking, towards protest, towards dissent. And it completely devalidates any talking points, even just and that's what could be really, it can be really just mind-numbingly awful to be in the West and to have viewpoints like yours or mine and have to sit through that, not only in your day-to-day life and seeing it on the media, but talking to some people. And you never want to be, I like to, Thomas Sankara, we must never stop explaining. We must never stop explaining. We should always be trying to educate ourselves and others, right?
Yeah.
But that at the same time, I mean, that's how I got to my point. I had patient people who had been they had their skin in the game for decades, like labor leaders, Chicano activists, Black Panthers. I had people who just gave me the time of day to talk to me.
Right.
I was just some dorky college kid, but still, it is just absolutely I mean, I didn't have to spend Thanksgiving this year in the United States, but I imagine if I did, I'd be sitting there just rubbing my temples and just another drink. I would, because it's you're already putting up with the discourse between your drunk conservative uncle and then your annoying professional managerial class liberal cousins or something like that. Everybody knows that experience. Thanksgiving is about fighting with your family. It's a bonding exercise. It's a love language.
For sure.
It's I mean, having to sit through that and feel like I have a friend back in the United States. We met in university. He was one of my best buddies from college, and he kind of was one of those guys that was, I wouldn't say politically conscious on this overt level, but he was always around me. We're spending so much time together, so I'm just yammering all the time about socialism and stuff like that, and anti-imperialism history, and he at least found it interesting. He wasn't annoyed by it, surprisingly.
Right, yeah. That's
Talked
a
about
good
it a lot.
situation. Yeah, so, on the point of never stop explaining, never stop educating, I mean, the U.S. has really gotten good at getting people to self-censor, though. I remember, going back to the 2019 protests in Hong Kong I was talking about, I remember LeBron James, when he was pushed on, his take on the situation in Hong Kong, he said, "I just don't think we have all of the facts." He said something really simple like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they absolutely blasted him. And they started going through basically the NBA players one by one after that. They were being asked, "Oh, what's your stance on the Hong Kong situation?" It was like McCarthyism 2.0.
Oh, yeah. And
I don't know if you've experienced that in the West too, where you've got to be careful about what you say around who, or did you have an environment that that wasn't really much of a concern?
Oh, I mean, again, I grew up in a very conservative area, so I mean, it was as simple as things of people not standing for the pledge. Actually, it's kind of, I mean, it's quite disturbing, but even my friend who's involved in the story would laugh about it now. But when we were young, we were doing it was at a Veterans Day assembly, and just for disclaimer, I come from a veteran family, but what's really interesting is we were at this assembly that they did for Veterans Day in the United States, and one of my friends, he even at a younger time, he wasn't doing it just to be rambunctious. He just said, "I'm not going to stand. I won't stop you from standing. Do your thing, man." And that pissed a lot of people off in my school. We were high schoolers at the time, and I I remember during the assembly, they're all like kind of all these guys crowd around him, right? And they're trying to intimidate him. And they go, "Hey, you got to stand, we'll kick your ass." And like, he wouldn't budge. I mean, I gotta give him credit. Like some of these guys were like twice his size, massive. Yeah. And he said, "No, I'm not gonna stand." And when they all stood for the, I think as a Pledge of Allegiance, no, the national anthem. My apologies. They stood for the national anthem, and he sat through the Pledge of Allegiance too. And I think during one of those procedures, somebody puts him in a headlock, and all the guys just start wailing on him.
No.
Oh yeah, and we're teenagers at the time and stuff, and some of these guys were like legal adults at this point. But again, this was in a very weird conservative environment. But but he stood 10 toes. Like, I mean, he's throwing hands back at him too, and this was really interesting because he himself was kind of like a redneck working class guy and stuff. So it was very interesting to see him kind of become like isolated socially from that, not within like our wide reaching friend group. Most people, we were not. This was also during the, this was not like a kind of like the onset of the Trump era. Like, we weren't like super.
That's nuts.
Yeah, it was nuts. Oh yeah, and I mean, just the whole reaction to it too from like some people there. I mean, one of the most disgusting things I saw was a Korean War veteran came up to those boys afterwards and all saluted them and thanked them. I remember that really that still sticks with me to this day in terms of my political development, was seeing, after all this discussion on free speech and shit like that, the moment that you go against like the grain,
right,
you're actually gonna get the shit kicked out of you.
Yeah, stand up for America, or we'll kick your ass because we're about freedom of expression.
Yeah,
it's like,
exactly.
Hold on a second.
Exactly.
How do you square that?
And that for him and I both, he's very politically conscious as well. I think he would, I'd say, prescribe to the same ways of thinking as I do, but we come from very different backgrounds. But it's really interesting to see how that impacted both our personal development, but also our development at looking at the world.
Yeah.
And to kind of circle back to what you asked, there's that instance, but also there's a lot of times when I was in liberal academia, when I was a university student, I always I pride myself on being able to get along with people, to have discussions, conversations. But there was a lot of times where it just felt like, it felt like you were almost like, maybe not as much in liberal academia, because a lot of people kind of have like an infatuation, or at least some like interest in like people who are into radical stuff like that, like theory, especially in it's academia, right? But I had a lot of kind of like, again, a lot of eyebrows were raised against me from a lot of liberals when I kind of was like stood back on some talking points, like regards to Russia and Ukraine or China. And stuff
yeah,
like
that really gets people going sometimes.
Oh yeah, and again, I mean, like, yes, you have like this very like just like low-hanging fruit, with a lot of conservatives with the freedom of speech, they stand for the flag, but a lot of liberals like will up the notch to moral superiority, kind of, the chastising, the condescending attitude towards you. And it was just that really I learned also being in professional circles to kind of be careful about what I say when I say it, but my political views, I didn't want to like get myself into a position where, at the time, of course, where it would like harm my job. But now, in terms of like where I'm at, both in my career development and where I'm at personally, I feel a lot more open, being able to like show that I disagree with these talking points, because
you're in the safety of China now.
Yeah,
that's the irony.
Yeah, right.
Now you can say whatever you want.
Yeah, no, it's really mind-boggling too. And I mean, yeah, it is. It was really funny because it wasn't just like kind of like having like this social stratification from like liberals or in your academic or professional circles, but it was also, I mean, like as I mentioned with my buddy, like your physical safety becomes something that is like something you start to think about more and more. As you progress into get into kind of more dissent and viewpoints,
right?
Because we saw it. I mean, we saw during the protest. I was present at a lot of the activities that were going on in Portland and just all over the West Coast at the time. All the protests, and I saw even areas that there weren't a lot of protests. There was a ton of militia groups and stuff. Ton of like the Patriot Front from Washington. I don't know if you're familiar.
People in the U.S. are armed.
Yeah,
at the end of the day, so
it was you saw not only the bodily harm that these crazy crack job like just insane people from these like militia groups can do to you and stuff, the harm they can cause, but also your own state apparatus which collaborates with them.
Yeah,
you saw not only we had insane wildfires in 2020 all over the West Coast, and ICE was present up and down the West Coast, while a lot of people who are undocumented migrants in the United States were looking for shelter, looking for food. They were staking out locations where people were doing community action to like provide food, blankets, shelter, water, etc. Like these necessities
to pick up the.
Oh yeah. You had feds everywhere. I mean, it was really crazy. Not only the idea that like you are now under a spotlight from reactionary groups, from the government, but even just not only as on a personal level in your day-to-day life, but also the organizations you exist in. You know, we have so many instances of a lot of like, and I would sound a little paranoid to act like that every person who might be a little not all there mentally, who is drawn to politics that are dissenting, is like a fed. No, that's silly. But there are a lot of people who use these wreckers, or these, as we call them, these wreckers, or these kind of these people that infiltrate these circles. It doesn't even have to be like a radical organization, and they want to cause a bunch of problems. They want to disrupt. And so seeing this disruption, not only in your day-to-day life, your professional life, from people who aren't even state actors, people who are just brainwashed, you know, that is it's quite scary. I don't think it's anything that's ever like deterred me. There is nothing that I ever was like, that's going to stop me from wanting to figure out my truth, like see the world for what it really is, but also do something about that. But it's something that we constantly have to think about, especially in the Imperial Core. And as things progress, I mean, as optimistic as I am about kind of this accelerationist moment that we're in with the Trump administration coming back for a second time, I am now a lot more, I guess, interested in how people are preparing, not even people who are like overly politically active, but people who hold these dissenting viewpoints, how they're preparing to, you know, preserve themselves in this way without also withdrawing, without surrendering. You know, it's hard. It's really hard. It's one of those things that, because, you know, we see how the United States military industrial complex, the CIA, have treated people who are in these liberation movements, these dissenting viewpoints in the global south and in other countries. And we're getting that little boomerang effect now to where all those tactics being used abroad obviously are being used in the Imperial Core. And it makes a lot of us nervous, of course, and rightfully so. I mean, I think you'd be crazy not to think about that. But I think it is, it's something that has really interested me, is how now with like, since the Trump administration and since that instance that I told you about my friend, how that's accelerated. But also now more so than ever, there's actually, I feel like, a pushback against that more reactionary circles. I feel like a lot more people are starting to, I think, at least be like, this is bullshit, without being overtly political one way or another. They're just like, they're fed up with the chaos of it. So I think
there's got to be, when you get to a point, I guess, when there's nothing left to lose, maybe people will, just kind of say what they want. But there are so many mechanisms in place, like you said, the fear of political violence. If your views are a little bit too far off the mainstream or whatever it is acceptable, and also, you know, from the perspective of looking at your professional career too, like looking at, well, what would happen if, I get blacklisted? Like, you know, you've got people who are going around looking for, like Dershowitz, looking for anybody who protests in support of Palestinians, and looking to basically dox them and make sure that they have no economic opportunities in the future. I had, you know, obviously when I was talking about it happened in Hong Kong too, the Hong Kong protests, when I was talking about that, I did so from the safety of mainland China, as ironically as that sounds, but I was able to express my views safely from mainland China. If I was in Hong Kong, I wouldn't have done it. I would have never started my channel, because I have kids, and I would have been worried that the rioters would have come after me, and my family more so. But when I made those videos, I had so many people from when I lived in Hong Kong reach out to me and actually thank me for putting those videos out, because they said exactly that. They said, we really want to say this, and thank you for saying it for us, because the rioters are really violent, and they would come after us if we said that. They would come after our businesses. I remember picking up a Hong Kong friend from the Shenzhen Bay port, when they were coming over from Hong Kong to Shenzhen to do in mainland China to do a pop-up art exhibit thing. And as soon as I picked her up from the port, she said, finally, I'm free to say anything I want. She had to wait until she came to mainland China.
Wow.
to say whatever she wanted. And it was actually true. It didn't matter in mainland China, if you were talking amongst friends, whether you supported the protesters or not, you could have these conversations. Of course, there's a level of censorship on platforms. But for all intents and purposes, she came over and she felt a release and she felt more free over here. When I started talking more about and pushing back more on anti-China propaganda, I had mainstream media outlets that came after me.
Yeah,
I had a think
that.
tank, ASPI, Australian Strategic Policy Institute, wrote about me also, and they're funded by the U.S. State Department. I had the CBC from Canada interview me for 35 minutes or 30 minutes, and I was so careful to answer in a way that they couldn't cut me out of context. And the result was they cut 3.5 seconds out of our interview to make it sound like something I said something that I didn't say. And it was so blatant that when I wrote to their ombudsman, they had to apologize. And they said, oh, we'll write a correction on our corrections page. It's like too little too late.
Yeah. No.
If I were living and working in Canada, I mean, my career opportunities would be severely hindered. They would look up my name and they'd say, oh, CBC says this is a CCP shill, working for the Chinese government, which is completely false. But that would have totally ruined me. So again, if I was looking to do what I'm doing here in Canada, I probably just wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not gaining financially from it either. It's just something that I felt really strongly about and message that I wanted to get out. But that's how good they are at silencing you in the West. Again, maybe as people have less and less to lose, as the situation gets worse, they'll be like, all right, it doesn't matter anymore. Let's just say what we think. But they're really good at censoring people. I'm curious what you think, though, about what Elon Musk is doing. Are you on X?
No, I'm not. I've actually saved my sanity, and
okay,
yeah, I'm not. And now what is that? Blue Sky.
Yeah, I don't know much about it, but
yeah,
I know it sounds like it's a little bit of a circle jerk over there. But,
yeah.
People who are like, oh, Elon Musk is far right, and you got a bunch of these people. You had a lot of China propagandists too. There were what was his name? He was one guy who was really responsible for pushing these narratives about Xinjiang, and every time he posted, people would just humiliate him,
ratio him,
and for example, he tries so hard. Like there was this during the poverty alleviation campaigns. There was a campaign to teach kids around China about proper teeth brushing techniques, and one of them happened to be in Xinjiang, where they had this social worker going around, and he basically tried to paint it as a form of colonialism. Yeah, teaching these kids to brush the teeth. You've got these social workers going. I can't remember how he did it, but it was such a stretch that he got humiliated so badly. And this guy, I wish I remembered his name. It'll come to me. Because I remember he was one of the earlier people that I interacted with, and I was really respectful to him in the beginning. I said, I would love to have you on my show to talk about your work. And he just flipped out on me. He's like, "Oh no, you can just repost my stuff if you want on Twitter." And I'm like, okay, this guy, no, he doesn't want to get in front of anybody who's going to be a little bit critical of him. And I blocked him. I ended up unblocking him later because I underestimated his entertainment value with this kind of stuff, like brushing teeth as a form of colonialism. But he completely deactivated his X account and he went over to Blue Sky.
Oh, interesting.
So I feel like there's these people who are kind of tired of being in a more open marketplace where they're looking for basically an echo chamber of sorts, and that sounds like that might be what it is. I'm not sure if I'm interpreting it correctly, if that is more of a left-wing space or an area where people are going to go less challenged. There isn't a community note system. I don't know what you've heard about Blue Sky. I really don't know much about it.
Yeah, honestly, that's I think that might be one of the few things that sets me apart from people in my age group is I've especially recently, I've tried to just kind of draw back from social media a bit and stuff. I still have the old personal accounts and stuff like that. But I do monitor everything mainly through the lens of I see stuff on Reddit, tons of reposts. That's mainly where I would get a lot of news or in other sources. But the X and Blue Sky thing is really interesting because I feel like, it's Elon Musk is a whole topic in of itself. But I think it's really interesting seeing how people are still in this. We kind of thought we were at this point where all the social media websites had kind of found their spots. The giants have found their place, but it's funny seeing these. Even if Blue Sky is not a genuine thing or genuine alternative to X beyond just wanting to become more like a left liberal echo chamber, I still think there's a lot to say in regards to people kind of want to de-link or decouple from these platforms. I think X is really interesting now too. I can't believe I'm calling it X right after all these years. It still feels weird.
It took a while. Yeah. I'm finally on board.
Yeah,
It took a while.
Right. No,
I
but
still say tweet when you send out a tweet though. That's still in the language.
No, it's in the lexicon for a while. I think it's really interesting how people have been trying to like kind of decouple from that too. And to kind of shift the conversation in a certain direction, a lot of people who are politically aware and active obviously see the value of media because it's, I hate to say it, we're on our phones a lot. And, that's where we see a lot of news. It's where we get the most of our news. We see it on the internet. We see it on streams, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like there might be a little too much. I don't want to say there's too much, but I think there might be maybe they kind of put the political discourse on social media websites up on a pedestal of like for like what I can do right now. And I feel like that is a big thing, especially in the West, is like kind of what we call like terminally online. Like I feel like there's a lot of people who are only viewing these objective circumstances in reality through the lens of social media, because a lot of times, we're at work and we have to go home. Yeah. So we're interacting with this stuff and we're getting this news in the same way that our parents did, like turn on the TV, but we're getting it through a far more nuanced and complex system of social media on our phones, various channels, YouTube even. I think though right now one of the most important things in regards to this social media is like continuously like monitoring the situation with like what we were talking about, censorship, how they try to crack down on it, where there's discourse. But at the same time, I think it's really, and obviously having a media presence for organizations or individuals is really good. But I feel like a lot of people would miss out on a lot of opportunities for political growth and development or organizing or doing something instead of kind of like being in this doom scroll mentality if they stepped back from media. And I'm more specifically like speaking about people from my own generation, like we were the first generation that was so digitally embedded, what I'm saying? Like we had so much, even like my, family members and stuff who raise children, like they've had their entire lives of their children on Facebook or on Instagram since they were born. Yeah. That is a very interesting thing to me. And I won't speak it in too much length, but I think about how much we like insert our ourselves into our social media avatars, or how we also look at the world through this kind of lens. And I think there's so many, obviously mass media is a tool and it's a weapon even. And I think that's very powerful, and we should always seek to understand how it's used against us, but also how we can use it to combat opposition, to combat all these false narratives. But I think what's really the most important thing now for my generation too is to log off for a second and say, I'm going to go outside of this. I'm going to go to this organizing demonstration. I'm going to go to a meetup. I'm going to like go do something. It doesn't need to be like a big political party meeting. It could just be going out and stuff, because I feel like there's so many, it's really interesting is I know so many people who I think are just so brilliant. They're so politically brilliant with like how they view the world and stuff, more so than I am. They can just like, almost like they have just like this instant photographic memory of like being able to, remember things, to dates and stuff. It's quite insane, but at the same time, they're not putting that into practice. They kind of just become a bookshelf and stuff. And that's what I really have also, that was a big reason I wanted to move to China, was I wanted to be on the ground, at least in a different circumstance or context. Right. I saw the cool videos, especially with Chongqing, but I didn't want to just like see it and have that interaction with it through my phone. And luckily I had the material abilities to do that, to move to China, to pursue this career over here, but also see these things on the ground. So I think, most importantly, and like, we should always be monitoring the situation with Blue Sky and X. I mean, it's entertaining, like you said. Like you could see a lot of the anti-China stuff. But
I mean, at the end of the day, too, if you want to get something done, I mean, getting offline and organizing. I mean, at the end of the day, if you want to reach critical mass, you got to play the game where the game is played.
Exactly.
Though, right?
Exactly.
And so you still got to bring it back onto these platforms at some point. To it doesn't mean you don't go offline, regroup, get your strategy, and go on. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it seems like this is going to have to play a part in any sort of future movement.
Absolutely, and I think that I'm glad you mentioned that too, because I wouldn't want to seem like I'm going like on this like almost like anti-social media. Right. No. I think it's I appreciate you bringing that up. I think it's really important that we understand both the limitations but also possibilities that mass media and social media, both as like functions, but also as little ecosystems in their own right, have for us, and how we can, again, It's how we've distributed so much media that goes against the rule and apparatus. Like so many like on the ground videos that were taken by people, especially in Palestine too. And like I think Telegram, you know, that's been getting a lot of ire from the, you know, a lot of European countries, the United States, because it is not only is it a lot more kind of about encrypted, you know, discussions and chat, but it's also a way for channels to disseminate material and stuff. And I think really seeing like those functions is really, really inspiring, because 30 years ago this was impossible.
Yeah.
You would not get that. You would not get this like on the ground, like not just somebody who's coming in from like especially a Western country represented by MSNBC, CNN, et cetera, and kind of being like a little more, I would say, empathetic towards the plight and the situation in these countries like Palestine. But also now you can see it from their viewpoint. You could see it, and it is absolutely harrowing. It is to see that close is kind of like the. I think it's broken a lot of people's brains, like, and it should, it honestly should. If you could see such so many atrocities committed against human beings on a day-to-day basis on the internet, I mean, it's going to impact your psyche a lot. But I think it's also oddly so powerful and stuff. I think it is. I think social media is a weapon, and so I'm glad you mentioned that, because we should be using it, we should be utilizing it, but we should also know when it's time to do something outside of that. And luckily, I think it's very rare. I think it's more with people who, a lot of people are political. I'm a self-professed political junkie. I love this stuff. I mean, I find it absolutely interesting, not only because I think it's just absolutely mind-blowing, politics, but also how it impacts our day-to-day life and how we could change these things. But I still think at the end of the day, it's being able to know the functions and the possibilities that we have with social media, like you mentioned, like what we're doing now. That's really good. I also think at the same time, though, is building another platform in person organically is also very important too. We need both.
Yeah. I mean, with I guess there was a period of time though with social media, you wouldn't be able to say that so with such confidence, because before they kind of just open up the gates on X, everything was kind of, you know, whether it be your Google News feed or Facebook, your feeds seem to have become tailored towards your own interests, and it actually reinforced this creation of an echo chamber. Whereas X, I see it a little bit more as kind of a free for all. Yeah, it's just whatever goes. I mean, you can kind of see Elon seems to be I don't know what's going on. He seems to be kind of like self-censoring himself to a certain degree, because before he went to Israel, he was a little bit more direct and open-minded about things like saying, well, you know what Israel's doing? They're just going to create more terrorists. He was a little bit more, you know, logical and pragmatic about it. But after his visit to Israel, all of a sudden, he came close to becoming, you know, a censor, where he was saying anybody who uses the phrase "from the river to the sea" will be banned because that is considered a call to violence or whatever. I don't think he ended up following through on that, but all of a sudden he shifted. But at least on his platform, everything is kind of a free-for-all. This is where people are seeing the most graphic images of Palestinian children being completely destroyed by this war. And obviously he released the Twitter files that showed the extent of government involvement in social media, causing even Zuckerberg to say and to admit the involvement that the government had on his platform, and causing him to push back and say he's not going to endorse either candidate, he's going to stay in the middle. To revealing the fact that there was a shadow banning system that throttled certain people and didn't. And so now I think as many problems as I might have with Elon Musk as a person, the platform really seems to be open. Now that could go either way, because obviously complete openness and letting people just do whatever they want on the platform may come with some risks also. But it is going to be that kind of moment of awakening for a lot of people. You did see an exodus in the beginning when Trump was banned originally. You saw a lot of right-wing voices leave the platform.
Absolutely.
For Trump's, what was it? Was it Truth Social, or was that a different one?
I'm trying to remember.
There was one, but there was a bunch of right-wing platforms that opened up. But they all ended up coming back afterwards. Now you're seeing I think it might be a temporary exodus of left-wing voices over to Blue Sky, and what they're looking for to rescind back into the safety of an echo chamber. Because it's kind of been a shock that this is a free-for-all. But I mean, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But I think no matter what you do in the future, obviously, and you see that too. Social media is going to have to be involved. But one thing I'm curious is, you have this idea to gain some perspective here and go back. How confident are you that there is going to be room for you to change, for anybody to change anything? I mean, this is one of the things that I found interesting about having a conversation with you, because I find that you are maybe more optimistic than people who have been at this for a bit longer, or who are in their 30s and 40s, and like there's no way that this can possibly change. Have you, like, how close are you to that point where you're just like, there's nothing I can do to possibly change the political system in the US, versus, you know what, I think I can gain enough perspective and go back and actually change something? Like, where are you on that spectrum?
Oh, it's really dependent on the day. Like, like, if I haven't had my cup of coffee, I might be the latter. But no, that's a good question. I guess it's a thing that I constantly think about while I'm over here, and also in just day-to-day life, is like, what is it going to look like for me? I would never, I think it goes without saying, but I'll still say it. Like, I don't fancy myself somebody who's like some over intellectual, somebody who has like leadership capabilities or anything like that. I don't see myself as like wanting to be the loudest voice in the room.
Well, never write off anything too early.
Yeah.
But a bare minimum, you're politically aware enough to be involved in some sort of a movement in some capacity, right?
Exactly.
So from whatever vantage point, what do you think? Like, are you becoming more pessimistic, more optimistic? You're still kind of in the middle. You're kind of like, or you're just like, no matter what, I got to give it a shot. Like, what, you know what I mean?
Got to give it a shot. I don't have, especially in my eyes, I don't have room for this pessimism yet. I mean, like what Gramsci says, optimist of will, pessimist of, I'm a logical pessimist. That is, if you're a logical pessimist and you could see that things are like obviously bad, but you have that willpower just to soldier through it, I think that is something that we have to constantly reinforce every day. Because like, I would be absolutely foolish to think that it's going to be easy, or it's going to go this or that way. I can't even tell you like what the next month is going to be, but I can say that seeing the developments in the global south, I think, is one of the things that is the most inspiring towards people in the imperial core. Those are the people we're learning from. And to see people who have lived through such completely different circumstances that are so foreign and alien to us, like the idea of being bombarded with bombs, of being attacked, being subjugated, being treated like animals for decades, and yet you could still fight. That is absolutely a lesson that we need to have. And I'm not at this point, like, I don't have kids, I don't have a family, I don't have these things that I need to focus on and take into consideration. Right now, the slate is pretty clean, and that is, I think, a huge advantage, at least for a lot of younger people too, is we're kind of coming to this when it's starting to really heat up. You understand what I'm saying? Like, I could totally empathize with people, especially who live through not only like, civil rights, sure, but also the Occupy movement, like, and having that political burnout, that apathy and stuff. Especially in the West, like, and towards like any progress in the West, I absolutely empathize with that. I mean, shit, I feel that a lot, even when like in my brief, like, since like 2016. But at the same time, I see myself going back and get even more experience that might even be more valuable than being over here, because I'll be actually in practice. I want to be involved in labor organizing. I want to be in community organizing. I want to learn from the people there who've already been putting so much work in. I can't tell you when or where that will be, certainly, but it's something that has been on my mind the moment I came here, and it was kind of the objective of like how I was going to spend my time here. And it's happening more and more. Like, we're having this, change where not only Westerners are coming to China and they're just blown away by how they've been lied to. Like, I've met so many young guys, so many young women here that come here for vacation or as students or they work, and they just are like completely blown away how they've been lied to, how completely like wrong they were about like what socialism is in China, or what just China in general. And a lot of them, they might just go back to their countries after their trip or year abroad, and they say, oh my gosh, this is what I actually saw here. That is huge. That has opened up the conversation even more, and that is super valuable, because you're getting people who went there to say, no, like, pause, like, there's more than this. And so I think that's just as valuable. I mean, I wouldn't say just as valuable, but it's very valuable in of itself that people who aren't even like ideologically motivated at the beginning come here and they leave changed. They have a changed perspective. For me, and there's a lot of young people like me. I might seem like an anomaly, but I know quite a few people who are planning or have gone abroad to socialist countries or developing peripheral countries with their own liberation movements to at least study the circumstances or do something to help out and stuff. And I think this number is going to keep increasing over the next few years, especially with people coming to China specifically. It is the most, like, it has the most material benefits, best quality of life, best work. Like it's once you get over the certain learning curves and stuff, it can be a quite convenient and nice and pleasant life. It's why a lot of people stay here. That's another thing that's so interesting too, is so many people come here and they end up settling down for the rest of their lives. You know, they meet a local guy or girl and they get married, have kids, or a lot of them just live here. And that in of itself is a huge talking point to me, that they would rather be over here than in their home countries. But for me, with this clean slate I'm at and stuff and this intention, I really see myself doing the best I can in my own country back home and stuff like that. That doesn't mean I hope to visit other socialist countries. Like I'm planning on going to Laos at the turn of the new year. I'm hoping to see some of the political developments there. We'll see how that goes. I have a few friends who work down there who are related to kind of like the governmental stuff. But I hope to see so many of these developing, projects, these non-aligned anti-imperialist projects. As I grow older, it'd be a great joy to be able to go witness that firsthand and to talk to the people. I think that would be such an educating experience. But I think at the end of the day, it is my intention to go back. Is there going to be room for me? I guess that's an even weirder one. Like, what is the to think about what the political climate's going to be like in the United States even 4 years from now? I remember when everybody said to me in 2020, they're like, "Will, calm down. You know, it's going to go back to normal." And I said, "It's never been normal,
right? And
it's not going to be the normal that it is now in 4 years.
It's just a matter of the mask has dropped, and you can see it for what it is."
4 years later, though, we're like down the line. We've seen that it's ramped up even more, and I feel like it's going to be. I mean, I would be lying to you if I didn't say that. I think it's going to be like, a little scary going back, especially, and kind of having this like culture. Everybody talks about the reverse culture shock that they do. They experience it when they come back from China.
The reverse culture shock.
Yeah. And I think that's going to hit really hard, but especially on the, not only just like the day-to-day life stuff, but also just the political level. But at the same time, I think I've been gifted such a valuable opportunity to come here, to experience it. It's been incredibly fun so far. It's been really enlightening, but I think now we're at this point where I feel like if I didn't utilize the things I learned over here in the future, I'd be doing myself a huge disservice. And also, again, I'm just a guy. I'm just a random guy.
Right.
There's tons of people like me. There's tons of people who are back in the West doing the same thing. There's people all over the world. But, it takes every blade of grass to make a field, right? So I feel like that is, if I was given this unique opportunity, I should do everything I can to at least utilize it. And so I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens to me and also the world at large in the next 4 years.
Yeah, so that might be an interesting note to end on, which is, what is it you actually got from the ground here? Like, what were your realizations, whether it be from looking at the U.S. from afar, whether it be observing what you see on the ground here, if it met your expectations, if there was anything that was surprising to you, what you gained from having conversations with ordinary people? Like, what are your, I mean, I know it hasn't been too long yet, but so far, what have your kind of takeaways been?
It's been really interesting. My language proficiency here is just abysmal, and I hope to continuously improve that. I'd feel like a crappy guest if I just came abroad and didn't at least put in the effort in to learn the language. But that's the biggest hope for while I continue to live here, because I intend to be here for at least we'll call short-term, long-term, right? At least a decent amount of time. I really see, I've talked to quite a few people. I've talked to a few people who are party members and stuff who kind of higher up. I got to learn about their political development. I got to learn about how it's so much more complicated than things can look, especially when it comes to our own personal conscious development of the world at large. A lot of these party members started out kind of like, oh yeah, whatever, I'm in the party. But then over time, I think especially in relation to the geopolitical occurrences that have been going on, a lot of them feel even more reinvigorated by, what's going on in the world to continue their work. So that's been really interesting talking to these kind of more higher up people. I met a young woman who is I think she's in the part of the youth league of the party here, and her English was actually pretty decent. And I randomly just saw her on the street, and she had like this really cool like shirt. It was like a hammer and sickle, and I was like, "Oh!" And I walked up to her, asked her where she got the shirt, in poor Chinese, and she goes, "Oh, I speak English." I go, so talked to her for a bit, and it was really interesting because especially since she's kind of like I think she's like maybe 19 or 20, so she's a little bit younger than me, but she had been like she maybe 18, something like that. But anyways, she was really just interesting to me to see this young woman who was so just openly like, let's get the job done, you know, like we're here for this. And I got to talk to her, and she grew up with parents who weren't really politically active nor like really cared about anything. It's just like, yeah, raise the kids, go to school. But she said that she was really impassioned by the Socialist Development Project when she met someone from, I forget where in the country, but it was from like one of the more inland provinces. And she spoke to them and got to learn about how their lives have been changed by the poverty alleviation campaigns. And she came from like a rather comfortable stand-in herself. And so I think that really invigorated her to be like, hey, like I can get involved in this. Like, look at what's going on. So speaking of these locals has been really cool, at least the ones that I can communicate with. And I hope to, you know, it's my objective here to continue to at least just do this social investigation of like talking to day-to-day people. And as my Chinese improves, I really hope to have these conversations. Beyond that, it's just been like kind of having an appreciation for the historical aspects. Chongqing itself is a, you know, when you asked me why I came here earlier, there's abundance of reasons, but I was so fascinated with the history here. And, you know, just you get to see like Zhou Enlai's old residence. You get to see all these like sites that, and of course the martyrs tomb, Li Shimu, like those sites are part of history, you know, and not only as like being a huge history nerd, but also just seeing the legacy of these sacrifices has been really empowering to me. To see a country where it's not like, you know, where you would never see monuments for, you know, socialists or you know, like communists in the United States, and to see that in action, and to see that people remember it, talk about it, it's been really empowering. And so there's like, yes, there's this intellectual side to it, and also just, I mean, seeing like the obvious development, the high-speed rail, the abundance of just buildings shooting up left and right, like actually seeing material development is a huge thing. But it's also the spiritual part of it. It's like, it would, you know, to kind of play back on what you said earlier about like, do I ever like feel like pessimistic or to an extent, or do I feel like nothing's going to happen? Again, it's all about how I feel on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. But then when you really start to have this appreciation for the sacrifice that millions of people like put into, you know, building this, yeah, it makes you feel like there's no excuse, especially for a young guy like me who I don't have obligations in the form of spouse or family. I don't have kids. I have a clean slate. And you see just how people not only remember these stories of these countless nameless people, but also how it inspires us today. It makes you realize that the train is still moving, and we have so much work. There's so much work to be done, not only obviously here, but just all abroad. And I really think that was probably the biggest thing for me, was the spiritual side of this, or the emotional side. Like, again, it's one thing to have like these concrete examples of like, oh, I could like bring this back to the United States and explain this. I still need to keep reading up on you know, China's socialist models and economy, its social development, its history, etc. But truly, I think just on the spiritual and emotional side is seeing what that means to people in their day-to-day life, like what the sacrifices that they made. It makes you never want to stop. And so whenever I start to get, you know, this like these feelings of kind of uneasiness, uncertainty, burnout, which everybody has, especially being a young man in this day and age and living abroad, you're always left with a bunch of questions. But you see that type of stuff, and it stokes a fire in you, man. It's really interesting. I always felt that way when I talked to some of the older generations that were involved in the civil rights movement, Panthers, Chicano liberation people. But seeing it over here also in a completely different culture it's just been really, really interesting. So I think that's been a huge plus for this, is just being inspired by it. It's really inspiring.
Well, I guess, you could probably look at the actual mechanics of how they accomplished poverty alleviation. You look at the fact that, I guess, also seeing that this is possible. You say that it's possible to do this. And then you look at the level of energy and commitment and enthusiasm that's required for it to happen. It's you could go back and speak confidently about it and say, this is what's happening. We can do it as well. I suppose you have an additional challenge, though, that they don't have here, where, I mean, a lot of people don't realize how responsive the government here is to the needs of the people. It's kind of funny, though, because like when you're in the middle class, low income and stuff like that, you get a lot of people who really are appreciative of the system here. But you get a weird phenomena, like if you do business and stuff like that, you see that the richer and richer someone is, the more money they have, the more likely they are to be a little bit less positive about the government,
Yeah.
which seems counterintuitive because it's like they've enriched themselves within this economy here. And I've tried to come up with theories of this, and I feel like they look at the West, at what wealth can buy you in the West. Wealth can buy you power, and wealth can enrich you more. Obviously, there's been a drive against corruption here and stuff like that. So, the people who have access to that pay-to-play system of corruption are the people with money. So I wonder if they're just like, I could be even more filthy rich if I was, in the West. It seems like it's a lot less safe to be poor in the West, but it's less safe to be rich in China, which I think is the correct direction. It should be. But then you've got these other challenges in the U.S. It was George Washington who said democracy is like two wolves and a lamb voting on what's for lunch or something like that, where you've got this system where you can only think short term. You can only think in 4-year blocks, where you have to convince somebody that my 4-year plan is better than their 4-year plan or what I can accomplish in 4 years. Whereas here, you can make a 30-year plan, a 40-year plan, a 50-year plan. Whereas here, if somebody's voting, and we're short-term creatures. I mean, especially now that we've got things like TikTok and all these YouTube and whatever, swiping through videos, they want to know what are you going to do for them tomorrow? And I almost feel like the Western political system, I wouldn't be an advocate of saying the Western societies need to adopt what China has. I think every country has their own system that works for them. But I feel like, though, when you have a system where you've got to go out and vote every 4 years or whatever it is, the most effective way of doing that and bringing people over to your team is by distinguishing yourself from the other team, which by nature means that you thrive on division. You have to divide your population and saying, why is that side, whether you want to use Hillary Clinton's word, why are they the deplorables, or why are, and it just creates such division. I don't know if there's got to be like a breaking point where enough people realize this is shit. Like, no matter what, we're just continually shooting ourselves in the foot or doing donuts in the parking lot, like you said, where then people are willing to say, okay, we got to go back to the drawing board. And then with your experience of seeing what's possible, what's needed, what's required, then that can come in. But before that happens, I wonder if you're just going up against a lot. It's really difficult with just the nature of how Western political systems work, especially when you add in the element of how corporately driven these popularity contests are every 4 years, because that's what they are. You just have to convince people, vote for me, and sometimes a little bit of showmanship is involved, a little bit of, who spent the most money on your campaign. It comes down to that a lot of the times. I mean, it seems like such a superficial system in comparison to what they have in China. Again, wouldn't be an advocate of saying the West should adopt China's system, but it comes with a unique set of challenges, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting too. It's everything's constantly changing. Like, nothing is ever like exactly as it is, like even just like a day ago, right? So like every development that we have, these developments are typically like, they're negative outcomes of the policy, both on the foreign level and domestic level. Every opportunity we have to use this, these instances as kind of ammunition against the, as talking points of saying like, look, this is wrong. Here's why it's wrong. Here's how it's affecting you negatively. That's important, but also offering an alternative to people is a big thing too. And yeah, going up right now, I would say that, this is just an armchair, analysis, but I am not convinced right now that you could just like waltz into the United States and be like, we need, socialism or this or that. It's way different. It's changed so much even since 2016 that even with like kind of the rightward shift, you still have a lot of people who have especially in my age group and like some younger millennials, they have this outlook towards socialism that is a lot more, and that could be a vague term. They have a lot more positive attitudes towards it in comparison to prior generations. This is because of the material circumstances. So again, in light of like Trump's second term coming into play soon, and then also just the continuous just the craziness that keeps going on, I feel like it's sad to say, but these negative outcomes due to the system are going to be the biggest educating opportunities for people. And it's sad. It's like, that's how we learn those, through direct experience. That's where all of our knowledge comes from. So it'd be silly of me to say that we could just go over there and convince people.
Right.
And so that is really the biggest thing. It's like, I'm over here trying to have like an intellectual understanding of like the economic models, the history, the social functions, etc. And then there's the emotional side of it as well. I can only hope to at least share that with people and at least like learn the lessons that I've taken over here and put them into action in some way or another. Not like a blueprint, but just comparing the circumstances. And that's what we can only hope to do. I think it's going to be an interesting 4 years, though. I'm I'd say there's always room in the world for the brave, but it's it's going to be interesting. And I guess I mean, it's going to give you a lot to read about and talk about. That's for certain. So there's going to be no slowing down on that.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, I mean, it sounds like though you're more in kind of a discovery phase rather than a content creation phase. But if people wanted to follow you, are you posting anywhere? Are you doing anything, or not really yet?
Not really yet. You know, that's so funny. Is I used to work in media. I was a film major and stuff, and I've always been on the fence about that, if that was something that was even a viable option or if I'd even be useful in that regard. But, you know, I have a passion for media. I love film. I love discourse. I love journalism. These are things that I'm very interested in. I'm hoping to, on top of also just changing my, and advancing my political education, I would love to share things like that, but if the opportunity arises, it's something I'm definitely interested in. I think a lot of people are interested in it too.
So if people wanted to follow you, there's not really anywhere to follow you yet. They just got to wait until you're ready to
TBD.
Put your okay. All right. That sounds good. Now, you know what? It's really interesting to talk to you, especially a lot of the times content creators speak to other content creators, but to get a look into somebody who is potentially a content creator in the making. Again, that's a superficial phrase like you were suggesting earlier, but somebody who wants to put information out there and educate. It's really interesting to hear from somebody who is in the early stages of figuring out what's going on, what do we got to do, and things like that, and see it in the making behind the scenes. So I really appreciate that you sat down with me.
Oh,
I'm sure we're going to have a lot more conversations.
I hope so, yeah.
And thanks for coming out, man.
And thanks for having me, man. It was awesome.
All right.
Appreciate
See you soon.
See you soon.